So, good afternoon, everyone. So we saved the best panel for last. So this is panel number 4, Designing AI with Empathy. My name is Emmanuelle Demers. I'm a litigator and a doctorate student here at the Université de Montréal. I have the great privilege of moderating this panel. We have today 3 distinguished thought leaders in the field: Ivan Alfaro, Professor Hoda Heidari, and Professor Kingsmith. So I will let the panelists introduce themselves. If you could please tell the audience a little bit about your background and your research.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Ivan Alfaro. I'm a senior product manager at Relativity, so I work very close with Elise. Not too much on effort review, but in the initial customer evaluations and integration of those products with our technology. I have been with Relativity almost 7 years. My background is a little bit of mixed, so I have a background in computer science, then my bachelor's degree, then I have a PhD in information systems, and I worked for a while, and I came back to the industry, a little bit of academia. My initial research was more in use of social media by corporations back in 20 and 2019 when they're trying to figure out what to do with this new technology. And in Relativity are mostly focused on AI services. So maybe I provide infrastructure that Elise teams consume to provide our products to final users.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am Hoda Heidari. I am a faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University School of Computer Science. Officially, my title is the Canal Gates Career Development Professor for Ethics and Computational Technologies. I know it's a mouthful. My main appointment is in machine learning and societal computing, and that I think captures my research interest pretty well. My research interest, broadly construed, is in the area of AI governance, accountability, and AI policy. More specifically, my research has dealt with issues of fairness, accountability, and transparency when machine learning and AI more generally is utilized in high-stakes societal applications.
I'm A.T Kingsmith. I have a PhD in political economy from York, so I study kind of like the relationship between politics and economics in the context of emotion AI. So in particular, I'm looking at kind of the use of emotion recognition systems and its relation to mental health and mental health care. So I teach at Humber College in Toronto, where I teach in the Faculty of Social and Community Services, mostly training folks to become therapists, counselors. And I also teach at OCAD, teaching students to kind of connect art and mental health and technology. A lot of folks doing things like art therapy and stuff like that. So yeah, lots of stuff around empathy, bias, and ethics of AI.
So we've canvassed the audience and many students before the panel, and one thing that really came up is people want to know if you could share real-life examples of successful Gen AI applications that can solve problems.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I can expand more of the work that we did with effort review. And we took a very user-centric approach here. So in Relativity, usually when we talk to the clients, we bring the engineers, the product managers, and the designers to try to understand their workflows and their problems. Here is similar but different. So it's like machine learning, it's AI. We have a hypothesis of what we can do with these tools. We are not really sure what is going to be the workflow. We want to understand like more if these tools can actually like help our customers solve like real life problems. So we follow a similar approach, but we change a little bit of where we start talking to clients. We incorporate applying science in our groups. So we have product managers, engineers, user experience, and applying science, like talking to our customers, right? And at the beginning, we usually in the past, we are focused more on the workflow. You think about an application that's going to do reductions. So I have my document and I need to apply reductions. You can understand very well what is the technology, how to do that. And maybe you need to talk with your clients more to understand the workflow, user experience, how they can make this product to be used very easy. With AI, it's a little bit different. Like just want to understand first, is this something that you can understand? It's something that you're willing to use. And one of the first feedback that we got is about like privacy. What are you doing with my data? Like, if my data is going to OpenAI or is going to be used for other tools to be trained, I cannot release. So even that first like barrier, we have to talk about that. Then hallucinations, how you're going to prevent that. If you have the Bianca case, I don't want to be the lawyer who's going to be called in court. So how are you going to help us like, reduce these hallucinations issues? So we have to go back to the board. We have to figure out how to set up our privacy. Basically what we did is, with our partnership with Microsoft, we set up our Azure OpenAI services in such a way that none of our customer data is used either by Microsoft or OpenAI for learning or training purposes. So we solved that idea on privacy. The second approach that we got was hallucinations. So for the client, it was very important to really understand what was the decision behind our products. And that's a little bit of that slide that Elise couldn't show, but when we have the document decision, the section of the document that is driving that decision, and we have a very much natural language description on why the model believes that that is the right decision for that document. So we start with a very low-key user interface with the clients just running this in the real data, which is something that we also learned in the past. We try to evaluate this in academic data or public data, but we learned very quickly that the data for our customers is very nuanced in nature. So even though we can have like very good results with maybe Hugging Face database, when our clients use it, it's like, no, this is not working for me. But from the beginning, we have to build like a platform that we can test this very quickly in user data. And then like another layer of complexity there of privacy, because our customers' data is someone else's data. Like a lawyer works for a company, and that company have that data. So we have to work with legal. So there's a lot of layers on top of that, on how you have to work very close with these clients to really understand how you can evaluate these tools in different ways. It's not just the workflow, it's the privacy, it's how you present the results, how they can understand the results, how they can modify the results. And we learned that basically working with them hand by hand.
Thank you. And what type of feedback do you receive from your clients?
That's a great question. I think the first feedback that we got was mostly about data privacy and security.
Yeah.
Like, where is my data going? Who's going to get access to it? The second feedback that we got is, how can I keep track of my changes? So I do my prompting, I see some results in the product, maybe it's not doing well, I'm gonna change this, maybe it's doing worse. So how can I keep track of my work? How can I share my work with others? How can I make this like more a collaboration with a group that instead of just one person doing these promptings? So we got like a lot of feedback about workflows that we were not thinking about it. They thought about like collaboration and working over time versus like, okay, this is my description and I work on like case right away. So we learned there have to be a workflow of kind of like tuning the product for the specific case, and then we have to create a validation workflow for that, and how you can help clients understand you are ready to run this in the large case and step by step. So that was a lot of the feedback that we got.
Thank you. Just very general question to the three of you. Why is it important to design AI with empathy?
I mean,
that's usually a question that's left to the end from the audience.
I could say in like the mental health space where it kind of mirrors some of the conversations on the last panel where like a lot of these tools are to provide people with access to like legal supports they wouldn't be able to get access to. And so in the mental health space, a lot of these tools are providing people with mental health support that they wouldn't normally be able to get access to. It's not as good as in-person therapy, but it is a substitute, and it needs to be kind of designed with empathy so that the experience can kind of mirror the empathy that a good therapist would give a patient or a client, I think. So a good use case is when you're trying to digitize mental health care, you sort of need to make it sort of an empathetic experience because actual mental health care is trying to offer that, I think, at least good mental health care.
I would like to provide a very pragmatic response to that. I think we need to design AI with empathy because we want AI products and services that actually work. So to me, it's a very pragmatic consideration. So let's go back to this question of what do we mean by empathy, right? When we talk about empathy, what we are talking about is, understanding this person, their challenges, their needs, their desires, their values, and identifying with that, acting accordingly, right? So I would say that's what a good designer and a good engineer of an AI system should do, right? And I think what I have really enjoyed so far in this conversation we've been having is the fact that there has been a great deal of emphasis on the need to understand the use case, understand the user before you go ahead and apply this tool. I very much agree with one of the pictures that was shown here that AI is like a hammer, right? It has a lot of good use cases, but it's not a tool that you can use everywhere. So it's very important to understand, is this actually a use case? Can you massage your use case in a way that this particular tool can be used properly? And I think the starting point should be understanding the target, right? Who are we trying to serve with this tool, with this particular application of AI? Who is our target? Who is supposed to be served? And I think that to me is equivalent to designing AI with empathy.
Thank you. And what types of strategies can enhance collaboration between designers, users, and developers of AI solutions?
Funny you ask because I have slides on that. So can I use my slides, Alexis? The questions were relayed to me ahead of this panel, so I am supposed to address two questions. Let me start by the first one, I think, which is what we began with. So the question is, what strategies can enhance collaboration between AI developers, designers, and end users? So I would like to summarize my response into 2 bullet points before I go a little bit further in detail about into the second one. So I think, as I alluded to in my response to the previous question, I think one very important matter is training AI designers and developers to be able to take the perspective of the target user base and the perspective of those who are going to be impacted by their design. So we have already talked a lot about the importance of that matter, so I think I'm going to focus mostly on the second important strategy, which I think is facilitating effective participation by end users and impacted community in the process of designing and developing AI systems. So many of you may have heard about this idea of participatory design. This is not a new idea. It has been around for decades, and it has been a very impactful idea in other domains. And in my field of study, I come from an AI background. This is an idea that has been explored in the past decade or so, relatively extensively. But unfortunately, what we have seen so far is that the true to nature, perhaps as an academic, I'm saying this, it has been intellectualized a lot. There has been a lot of computational methods, computationally feasible methods to facilitate participation by non-technical stakeholders in the process of designing and developing AI systems. But unfortunately, those types of elicitation methods, those types of computationally feasible participatory approaches are not often practical. So, in a couple of years ago, we did this mostly in the context of AI, but I think it remains applicable to the new generative AI boom as well. We thought about what does it mean to actually design participatory mechanisms that would effectively allow non-technical users and those impacted by AI systems to have a say in the process of what kind of use cases we choose, how do we go about designing an AI system to address that use case, developing it, and then evaluating it. So we came up through a systematic study of both the participatory AI literature and also just participatory design in general. We came up with 10 axes along which one can assess whether a participatory framework is effective. And I think some of these remain, much of this remains valid when it comes to deciding what applications are, what generative AI applications are going to be beneficial to the target audience. So one axis of evaluation always has to be representation, We need to understand who the stakeholders of an AI system are and whether they are represented properly in the focus group that we start out with, trying to understand what are their needs, desires, and challenges. The second axis is we need to decide at what stage we seek their feedback about our AI design. This could be at the very early stages of selecting the use case, where to apply AI, which I would argue is probably where much of the impact is. It could be all the way down to the evaluation and deciding whether the system should stay in place or be sunsetted. The third criteria is the setting. If we have decided this is the group of stakeholders that I want represented and I want to ensure that they participate in the process of designing and developing AI, we need to provide the right conditions for participation. For example, the setting needs to be familiar, comfortable, and beneficial to participants. Oftentimes we see that many of these participatory approaches end up leaving a bad taste in the mouth of the people participating because they feel like they were exploited and there was nothing in it for them. The fourth criteria is the resources. One important criteria here is to make sure that participants understand what it is that they are contributing to. What is the system? They need to have the right background knowledge and expertise to be able to meaningfully participate. The fifth axis is communication. Again, one lesson that we have learned both from practice and research is that it is extremely important for lines of communication to be open between designers and developers of AI on the one hand and participants on the other side. And it shouldn't just be at the level of them participating in a study and we are done with them, but rather they should be able to provide feedback throughout the process and about the outcome of the participatory activity we are involving them in. Elicitation, especially when it comes to eliciting things such as values, needs, and challenges, I think it's important to be clear about what are the assumptions we are making and what are the limitations of the way we are trying to elicit their needs and desires and values. Just to give you an anecdote, I have done a lot of work on fairness, and there has been a lot of participatory quote-unquote approaches to elicit fairness notions from participants. What we learn is that if you don't do this carefully, you end up with a notion that has the stamp of approval of participatory, having been elicited through participatory methods, but it doesn't really reflect people's fairness conceptions in the given domain. Conflict resolution often arises when you have multiple stakeholder groups and they have different needs, values, desires, and challenges, and you need to make a decision as to how to resolve conflicts with them. Feedback about the activities is important, and I think I've already mentioned it in the context of communication as well, but after the activity is finished, I think it is important to ensure that there is the possibility for participants to evaluate whether the activity was successful. And finally, I think it's important to be clear about what are the benefits in the activity for the participants and how their participation actually ended up leading to a better designed product. And finally, evaluation. This whole process, once done, we need to have measures of success defined for it. I'm not going to go into the detail, but these are some of the main axes that I think any participatory approach should account for. And it needs to be evaluated across at least these 10 dimensions.
Thank you. Could you say a few words about the different methods to gather and integrate user feedback in the AI development cycle?
Yeah, so I can potentially just move to my next set of slides to answer that question. So I'm going to focus on the generative AI for now. So we have already talked about the fact that the generative AI, the way generative AI is developed and utilized these days consists of at least 3 key stages. One is we develop the base model. That part follows the usual AI lifecycle. We need to define the objectives. We need to figure out what data we have, decide what architecture we want to fit to the model, come up with the model, evaluate and refine it, and then deploy it. So that's how we come up with our base models. Then we have then we utilize that base model and specialize it to specific applications. We have seen several examples of that today. And then we have the prompting and use part, right? So once the model has been fine-tuned to specific applications, users can then prompt it to, for example, ask legal questions or ask medical questions. So the reason I'm going over this is that I think this tells us at least several key choice points that we can involve users and impacted communities into key decisions that we are going to make. I would argue that, for example, involving lay participants into questions about what architecture to use, it's going to be meaningless to them. It's not going to be really impactful, right? But there are certain key choice points along this life cycle that I just outlined very quickly that I think are very amenable to bringing people in, not necessarily technical people, but trying to understand, is this actually the right way of doing things, the right in the sense that it actually is consistent with the needs, challenges, values, and desires of those target audience. I think, again, this is the way I see it, is that this slide is a summary of everything we have talked about today. We have talked about different choice points through different panels and talks today. But I think in determining what is the intended use and application, that's one place where bringing in a diversity of perspective is extremely important. So when it comes to specific workflows, use cases, and practices, it is important to understand that those people who are in it are the real experts, right? So you need to talk to them, you need to understand what it is that they actually want and have a use for. Then when it comes to conditions of release and use, I think some of the applications that we saw today, it was interesting to me that most of them utilize the same underlying technology, a generative AI based model. But the real creativity and the real value was the way this was framed into a particular user interface and a user experience, right? So I think that's extremely important. Types of access we provide, the kind of user interface and user experience we provide, those are places where we can bring in a diversity of perspectives. When it comes to training and fine-tuning data, there is a lot of secrecy, especially when it comes to base models, about what are the sources of data. That's one of the advantages that some of these companies have, that they have been able to gather lots and lots of data, sometimes from proprietary sources, and at the same time, these data sources could be biased in all sorts of ways, right? So for example, if much of the data is the data on the internet, right? So we expect the data on the internet to be mostly biased politically, for example. It comes from a particular sector of the population. So that's the place where we can bring in perspectives and try to expand the representation. The other question that I think is, the other key choice point that I think is very important is evaluations. I think we already talked about reinforcement learning with human feedback, for example. And I have done some work on other types of evaluations, such as red teaming. One observation that we have made through that work is that the composition of that group doing the evaluation is extremely important in terms of how you end up, quote unquote, aligning your model. Another example of this, some of you may have heard about constitutional AI. This is this idea that you basically prompt the model, tell them, you are, a privacy-preserving model who respects copyright and so on and so forth. Different people may have very different conceptions of these values. They may write it down differently, and as the result, you can get very different different behaviors from your model. So evaluation, I think, is another key choice point that we can bring in. Our stakeholders, the diverse set of stakeholders, not necessarily just AI designers and developers. And finally, when it comes to prompting, I think there is something to be said about public education, making sure that users are informed, they know how to effectively utilize these tools, and putting together the right safeguards, and this goes back again to intended and unintended use cases. I have a ... in the end because there are numerous other places where we are making important choices as designers and developers of AI systems. This is just a very quick highlight of some of the major decisions that could potentially utilize a diversity of opinions, as opposed to just AI designers and developers trying to do guesswork around what is it that users want.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think I want to touch back on the idea of design with empathy that you mentioned, like a very pragmatic approach. At the end, you are working in this product because you want people to use it. And all these products that we have talked today to one way or another are going to change the way people are doing their job. So it's like a change management system. And I don't know how much you're aware, but law firms are very reluctant to change. Like they want things to do that. We have clients that still have partners bringing boxes to their house to do manual review on paper. They don't want to use the product, right? So all these products are going to change how people do their job. And you, as a company that want to provide value to these people and these customers, you also want to understand how it's going to change their practice. And you need to get buy-in from the key stakeholders, because there's a difference between the buyer persona, the user, the decision maker. So you have to understand those different components when you go to sell your products there. And something back to what you mentioned about this participatory approach, I think is key to understand when you're working with your customers and you're asking them to evaluate their products, it's time that you're asking from them, and this time is very variable. If you're a lawyer, you're billing by the hour, and the time that you're using to spend in your product, basically you are not making money for your company. So the way we figure out how to go around that is we ask our clients to evaluate our product in a real case that we're working right now. So it was an incentive for them to try to do this because it will make their current work faster and better. So that's one way of the approach that we cannot do that these participate themes and principles in practice to get them more involved with us. Otherwise, you're asking for something, but you're not giving anything back. So that creates a little bit of it's not equally relationship when you're working with these kind of groups on it.
I can definitely confirm that getting lawyers to do things differently and to change the way they work is extremely difficult. I've been involved for several years in different firms in testing different products, whether for e-discovery, for document review, etc. And well, lawyers are not only risk adverse, they're also very much change adverse, you know? I feel like it touches upon the identity, the core identity of people, but it is what it is. I would like to talk about, Professor Kingsmith, your field of research in emotion recognition. If you could tell us a little bit about how to address ethical challenges, because there are many different ethical challenges that arise in that field.
And so these slides were designed with empathy because they're supposed to be exciting. So it's the last ones we have to look at today. Hopefully they can make us feel a certain way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the two sides of kind of AI-powered emotion recognition in the context of mental health in particular is my use case, but I think it's applicable in lots of other contexts as well. So there are some obvious potential benefits, some of which I just kind of briefly mentioned at the outset, right? You can enhance mental health support. Apps like Woebot and Wyatt, and there's lots of other ones, Replica, can be used to provide tailored advice for coping strategies, cognitive behavioral therapy, getting access to kind of online support. There's a lot of significant risks, right? Sensitive emotional data can be exposed or misused. So we have to kind of, how do we balance empathy, data protection, some of these kind of underlying tensions, right? And in some ways, right, maybe looking at situations where we maybe shouldn't be using AI at all to solve a certain problem, right? Like Friedrich Nietzsche said that once you only have hammers, everything looks like nails. So maybe we don't use AI to teach our kids how to read or something like that. There's probably things that are not good for its use cases, and we'll talk about some of those too. So ethical challenges around emotion recognition in AI, I think one of the key things is that AI models inherit different biases in the training data, right? If the training data is not representative of diverse populations, then the AI is not going to be representative of diverse populations, right? So people estimate around 80% of all the training data used for AI is from white bodies, 65% is male, and 98% is able-bodied, right? But something like 24% of people, according to WHO, would identify as persons with disabilities. So again, very, very key lack of representation there. So no matter how good the synthetic data model is for kind of reimagining how certain groups might respond in a context, if you don't have data about those groups, what their faces look like, what the bodies look like, how they respond in different kinds of contexts, right? you're not going to be able to build representative data. So one of the big things is that the models just don't have data from non-white populations in particular. They don't map those biorhythms in the ways that we've mapped certain other kinds of biorhythms. So lots of real-world impacts there. You can mislabel emotions, right? If you don't have access to a deep database of faces from different kinds of groups. You can make inappropriate decisions in mental health, law enforcement, you know, and it can reinforce stereotypes and unfair biases. So the reality is, like, we need to go and be collecting more data. An example of this would be IBM did this thing called diversity in faces in 2020, but now they're facing a class action lawsuit because they were like, oh, you want us to get some more diverse faces? We'll just go to Flickr, take as many as we can. Well, this is all Creative Commons. You just took all that people's data. You're not properly sourcing it. Now they're facing a class action lawsuit. So again, right, their response to, like, we need to diversify the data is to commit a crime, essentially. So, like, it's clear that we need to put better practices in place, I think, for that. There's a privacy dilemma, right? Emotional data is obviously highly sensitive. Vocal tones, physiological signals, heart rates, breathing rates, biorhythms, this is all very, very sensitive data, right, that reveals real-time emotional states. I've been involved in some interesting research into what's called subvocalization technologies, which is when you measure the vibrations of, like, muscles in the throat. When you're kind of voicing things to yourself but not saying them out loud, it can start to almost read your internal monologue in some ways, which is, again, like, very personal, very sensitive data, right? So, like, how are we kind of managing this kind of data, right? There's obviously risks of data de-anonymization, right? People are trying to reverse engineer data that's been synthesized or kind of blocked, and there's sometimes ways to still get key demographic information from data that's trying to be protected and proprietary. So lots of potential for misuse and surveillance, profiling. Later I can talk about some specific use case examples. Just kind of moving along. I think two key ethical issues overlooked. We just briefly talked about data expropriation. So that would be like IBM going and, like, taking the faces of these populations without their permission. Again, sort of reinforcing the inequality by, like, not even asking these marginalized folks if these data can be used in the training. Another one is obviously the hidden labor costs, which I've sort of been talking to anyone today that will listen to me about, right? Which is just sort of like, what makes the machine go burr, the magic AI, is all of these people usually get paid like fractions of a cent to double check words, to double check sentences, right? There's this kind of, it's like when you pull up a rock and all the little things underneath that kind of scatter, right? There's like an underbelly to this cleanness of AI that is really powered by a lot of precarious workers that make it go. And it's not really kind of talked about a lot of the times, the ways in which that's really core to sort of this magic technology, right? We obviously know it's not actually magic. But I think a key to designing with empathy, right, is just these tensions around diversity in data. So, you know, more cultural representation, more gender exclusivity, age variation, a kind of intersectional approach, right, in a non-expropriative and more ethical way. So not like what IBM did, right? We need to kind of do the exact opposite of that. In terms of bias detection, right, there's a lot of things that folks have talked about today on and off, but things like regular auditing, engaging with users has been a really key theme that I thought everyone has brought up today, which has been really, really kind of exciting to hear, like kind of starting with the people that we're trying to help and working backwards, as opposed to like trying to convince them that this solution that you have is the solution that they need, which I think is really, really important too. So building privacy into AI, right? There's obviously examples of things that can already be done. You can do data minimization. So when Apple is using its Face ID, right, it's not actually mapping your face. It's trying to reduce it to just like a mathematical formula to take as little of the data from your face as possible, right? We could integrate that kind of practice, I think, more, like not trying to take everything all the time. Obviously things like encryption, but they don't always work. And another thing would be sort of more data anonymization. So just kind of stripping personal signifiers off some of these things. Obviously, people have talked about it a bit today. Synthetic data is a hot topic right now, right? Especially in things like the mental health space. Like, okay, you say I have a gap in that my data is not representing all these populations. Okay, put in some prompts. Okay, now go fill in this data. The problem is obviously the AI cannot generate good data about populations that it doesn't have any input data about in the first place. So if there's no if there's no real world data about, let's say, female identifying populations, non-white populations, then like the synthetic data about those populations is going to have the same gaps. right? So it can't manifest information about a population in which there isn't enough, right? So it's not foolproof, risk to reverse engineering, and then of course there's biases, again, around like what joy is, what happiness is, what a healthy heart rate is, varies across bodies, across cultures, across contexts. And so again, a word that's come up a lot today, I think, is context, and like how it's really important to situate the work of making the models make sense of the world in the context that they're trying to make sense in, geographically, but also temporally, right? So getting towards the end, right, one of the social implications that I do hope we talk a bit about today is this idea of moral de-skilling. And so, you know, emotional intelligence is already something that's really hard to learn. It's already something that a lot of us struggle with. Why I'm interested in it? I used to be really bad at it. Maybe I still am. But I think the tension is that, like, we're outsourcing this job to AI because it's a hard thing to do. And so we're maybe missing more and more opportunities to develop that kind of social skill, that soft skill of emotional intelligence. And so I was chatting with a few folks, just even as a professor, I've already noticed my students start to speak like ChatGPT writes, which is kind of like on the one hand, on the other hand, then it's like you can see it after like a year or two already like going into their natural language flows. And so 5 years from now, 10 years from now, like will we kind of look back to like the pre-GPT days when like we used to have linguistic diversity and emote in the post-GPT days where that stuff is kind of done for us. I think some of these conversations around like, is that what's in our best interests, aren't always kind of being had. So I think there's an issue around kind of normalizing AI to do a lot of our emotional labor and the kind of side effects of how we might sort of lose some of those skills, which I think is already kind of happening from being a sort of terminally online culture. You know, I think it's maybe intensifying some of these declines. So I think I only have one or two left. Just quickly, I think the core here is like we need sort of to rethink sometimes this idea of personal versus non-personal data. I think when you're looking at biomarkers, when you're looking at synthetic data aggregation, it kind of muddies the idea of what is personal and impersonal data. And so I think we need more research into like breaking out of that binary a little bit and like new ways of thinking about data categories. Obviously, folks have said it a lot, context is really important here, especially with legal data, medical data, emotional data, right? Data that people are giving that's sensitive and personal. And so I guess the key takeaways is just ongoing user involvement, you know, privacy by design, and again, the diversity. And it's one of those things, right? We can't just engineer diversity after the data has been collected. We need diversity in the data collection processes, which is something that I think kind of could stand to be deepened. So maybe that's it for that.
Thank you so much. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of your use cases, especially in the area of targeted manipulation?
Sure. Well, there's like a new software that I've been reading about. It's called College Watch, and it's like a new one for classrooms and stuff like that. And it's to like monitor students' attention. So you set up like security cameras in the classroom, and, and it checks like pupil dilation and like kind of focal. And like it checks for like you can even almost get things these days like heart rate variability from just like a camera shot almost. So it's like basically monitoring all the biosignals of the students to make sure that they're kind of like paying attention, seeing what their kind of emotional rate is. And again, like
it's actually really scary.
Yeah. I think we have this idea sometimes that like more data will get us closer to like the truth. And I just think that that's not always true. Like. No. You can't necessarily create a better educational environment by just mapping every element of the student's experience, you know? So that's like one kind of clear example of using emotion recognition software in the classroom. I mean, we saw a lot of this like during the pandemic. There was like these tools that would pop up when you're like doing online learning that would track your kind of presence at the computer, track your eyes, track your pupil dilation. And again, like I feel like, I don't know, most of the data shows that like when people work from home, they work almost just as hard, they work longer, they work their commute time. Like, people will work hard. You don't have to always be watching them. And I think it's a bit of a fallacy that like repeated surveillance and this kind of infantilization leads to better outcomes.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? So, to me, the use of AI, so you just mentioned about, you know, all the issues related to surveillance and privacy when it comes to the use of AI to detect emotions in the context of learning and education. So that to me is already a little bit less high stakes than mental health, right? So utilizing, let's say, generative AI in place of a mental health professional. So then my question for you is, what hope do we have for that use case? In particular, I think in my own research, what we have observed is that actually generative AI is not good at all in terms of mimicking the nuances of human behavior. So some of you may have heard about the push to designing agentic AI to kind of like, you define agents or personas to represent a human being, and you can use it, for example, as research participants to pilot something you've designed. And what we have observed is that, we have done extensive research on this, what we have observed is that these models remain very superficial. They cannot reproduce the nuances of the kind of stories people would tell. So my question is, do we really have any hope for the use of at least the current generation of generative AI models in that context, in your experience?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think the challenge in therapy in general is that people are really bad at being honest about when they're kind of having a bad time. Negative experiences, people are not good at prompting. And so one of the things that I think Gen AI can be useful for is like in support with like a therapist, you have a technology that is like kind of collecting these biorhythms, isolating them. Okay, so you have a high heart rate and stress when you're like on your commute or when you're at home, so you can start to situate it in space time and then maybe work through some of those tensions with a practitioner. I think then it could be useful as like kind of further data with supervised support.
Because it helps you identify triggers?
Yeah, and like what those triggers might be. Where I think what it's being used now is really just like, you know, like there's one therapist for every 5,000 people in Canada, which is not enough. And, you know, the request for therapy is going up. And so I think it's being used as a stopgap. And in that sense, I'm thinking back to even, I think, the first panel we heard this morning, which is like AI kind of tells you sometimes what you want to hear. It wants to please you.
Yes.
And so when you're like, am I that depressed? It's like, nah, you're okay, buddy. Just go. You want to go out tonight? Just go. And like, maybe it shouldn't be trying to please you in that moment. Like, and maybe we'll feel like we had a bad experience now with this product, but that's kind of maybe the thing you needed to hear. That's why like your therapist isn't supposed to be your friend per se. And so I think that's the tension. When it's a substitute, I see a lot of space for abuse, and there's already a couple of use cases of people using AI chatbots and it like driving them to suicidality, overdoses. There's like a lot of these examples. We're only going to see this stuff go up. But I think if you use it in conjunction with support, I think it could open things up.
But if you use it as an assistant to a professional, then does it actually solve the problem that we have, which is there's a backlog of requests for mental health professionals? So in that sense, what I don't understand is that does it solve the real problem?
I mean, I think there's no substitute for like we need to train and hire more people in therapy. We probably also just need to build our lives in ways that are less stressful would be the real solution. But I do think that like it can help a therapist maybe have like a higher caseload, can handle more people, that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, like, yeah, without like the material investment in like more mental health support workers, I don't think it can reshape the way that labor is done.
And I just want to be clear, I think this is a common theme we see with AI, that it's kind of like a Band-Aid, right? Like you can't really solve major societal issues by putting a Band-Aid on it, right? It may be, make things a little bit better, but it's not the ultimate solution in mental health and in all other domains.
Thank you.